we're here to talk about different ways that horror shows up in non-horrific things. For instance, your book, which is a superhero genre book, absolutely, has some parts in it that made my skin crawl. One involving a little boy's finger that was very violating and scary. And then another one a little bit later on involves some Ridley Scott Hannibal-esque surgery that quite, again, I'll leave it at that. But there's some scraping descriptions and whatnot that are absolutely terrifying, and also just like the general, I guess, as you put it in the book, splash damage of everything else, like people getting melted by lava, spines
Gross.
and ribs coming through things. These are all elements of horror, and so I'm wondering where do you demarcate where horror ends and begins, and where do you find it?
That's a great question. I think that there are one of the wonderful things about horror is like any moment has the potential to devolve into it, right? So I don't think there's any genre that is sort of like free from the potential of horror kind of like grabbing an edge and tearing suddenly, and it's in those moments of kind of unexpected, like whether that's violence or whether that's something just like extremely unsettling or disturbing happening in a like unexpected or in a kind of like uncanny valley kind of way, whatever. There's like tons of different flavors of it. But that it's often in those unexpected places where horror erupts most effectively. When it comes to like superhero genre fiction, I think that there's there are so many potential sites for it and for those kind of eruptions that I'm surprised it doesn't happen more often. Like on a very basic level, and I think, you've identified this really clearly, you have superheroic bodies, right? So you have bodies that are, generally speaking, one of the most kind of like universal superheroic traits is more endurance than the average person, like harder to injure, just kind of tougher all around, heal more effectively, whatever this kind of flavor is. So when you have a superheroic, like inhumanly strong and humanly tough body interacting with a normal human squishy body, like one of those things is going to give and it's going to be bad. Like it's just, physics and fragility, right? And the human body is, made of meat and pretty fragile, generally speaking. Like we're both very tough and very fragile at the same time. And those collisions, like not to be weird and make a self-reference or anything, but the collisions of those bodies represent like real potential sites of that rupture, or like where those ruptures can take place. Also, like superpowers or the kind of like things that can happen to a body to make it like super powered also have their own potential for horror there. Like what that if that element is transformative, like what does that do to the person or the body? Like what happens there, I think is really, really interesting. And a lot of the like substance of powers themselves are like actually pretty horrifying. For example, like I hate Cyclops. I think Scott Summers is a complete tool. Like, so I do not say this with any like real sympathy, but his situation is horrifying, right? Like he literally cannot open his eyes without a pair of goggles on, without like obliterating anything in front of him. He is a Medusa in the very real sense of the word. That's horrifying. That's a horrifying prospect. You're to look upon a thing is to destroy it, right? So just like every element of his powers is bad for him. You know, and his life and anyone else he might possibly come into contact with, right? And like there's definitely an alt reality Scott Summers where he or someone else blinded him in order to like live a life that was anything close to normal, right? Like there's for sure a you know, there's a real like there's something very like gruesome to everything about that, right? So yeah, I think that there's just so much there in superhero fiction that like it, so superhero stories are often like for kids, right? In this kind, or less so now, obviously, since like the grim dark revolution and like whatever, but there's still like a pretty strong like this is for kids subset. And there's, you know, especially across like a lot of the like the blockbuster Marvel Cinematic Universe, for sure there's kind of a like we need to keep this PG-13 so that we can tap into like a younger and family audience. Like that has to be preserved there, and because of that, everybody kind of has to be made out of rubber. Right? Like both heroes and villains and, you know, like sidekicks and hench people and ordinary humans kind of in the path of everything else have to be like kind of just like bounce off everything. And a lot of damage is often like cosmetic, like, or very minor, or even when somebody's laid up, it's very like, it's almost cartoony in the way that it's kind of done. But like, if you actually look at any of those actions, it's like, that is a spinal fracture. There is just no, like, there's no way that person got thrown through that plate glass window without like crazy lacerations, right? Like it is simply impossible, right? You know, not everybody is a stunt performer. And the only reason these people in this movie are okay is because they're all stunt performers. But if like these things were actually happening to real or untrained people who weren't like covered in fucking like anti-flammable gel or whatever, like this would be very bad, you know, and in a like really horrifying kind of way. So I think that in order for a lot of superhero fiction to function, it has to be kind of like rubber padded, right? And it has to be kind of like it has to have a lot of things softened and a lot of like you know, the consequences have to kind of be removed, right? Or like you kind of have to look away from that for it to kind of function. And so a lot of hench is like, well, what if we don't? Like, what if we don't smooth those edges out? What if we don't kind of pad everything over? And what if we really stay with those consequences? The results are really horrifying. And like that's where I think a lot of that horror erupts for me, especially like in superhero genre stuff. I think it's just a matter of like, the closer you look at a thing, the worse it gets.
Absolutely, yeah. And you're right. Like those pillar Marvel movies definitely just erase the horror of it. And an example from Hench that stuck with me is very vaguely, there's a bottle stabbing that has some gruesome consequences that I just can't really imagine it anything outside of like the Venture Brothers, which would have been R.I.P., which would have been played for last.
I'm devastated by the loss of Venture Brothers. Obviously, I think, you know, like
it's fair enough.
You know, there are like conversations between Red Death and the Monarch that like have had a profound creative impact on me. Like there's this one point where like the Monarch is describing like, you know, how like his hatred for this one person, like it really like, you know, got under his skin and defined him, blah blah blah. And the Monarch's like, you know, like, well, wow, like how did you let it go? And Red Death is like describes in like horrific detail how he murdered him. But he does it in like his villain voice, and then he's like, yeah, you know, like it's really a matter of like working on yourself or like he goes back to his like nice guy, and the Monarch is just like has been staring at him this whole time and finally says, if I was a woman, I would never stop calling you. And it's just this like everything about their interactions are so beautiful and perfect. And RIP, I will desperately like miss that. The definition of horror by like, does this scare me? Right? Like, you know, and like, oh, that I don't think this is horror because like I didn't find it personally frightening. It's such a weird way to define like what you think a genre is. Like, does this particular piece of media work on me in this specific way? And that's like, and I was wondering if you could like talk a little bit about, you know, why like horror is so personal and intimate that like we often kind of use like, well, how do I personally feel about this as a definition of like not just whether something is successful, but like whether it counts as part of the genre. You know, like I would never be like, well, I don't think Batman is a superhero because like he doesn't have superpowers and like that's what I think. It's like, well, I don't know, man, like all of Detective Comics like disagrees with you, but like I don't because I don't have this particular emotional reaction or I don't feel this particular way, therefore it doesn't count.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's something I spend a lot of time thinking about because my favorite modes of horror are or modalities, I suppose, are supernatural because of my Catholic upbringing. And that was very real for me when I was a kid. I was like, oh man, I fainted in church on Easter weekend once because I was like, this is when I get stigmata. This has got to be the time I get stigmata.
That's amazing.
Really, all it was is that I skipped breakfast. And I got taken down to like the priest's little kitchenette and I had to like splash water on my face. But I think about it a lot, and I think that there are a few reasons, there are a few elements of horror that make it a little bit different from other genres. One is what we've just been talking about, which is that there are elements of horror that come up in different things, and so it shares a lot with comedy in that way. Whereas like, because nobody's gonna say, well, I don't know, I watched Spider-Man 2 and I just don't think it counts as a superhero movie, you know, or something like that. Or I guess you could even say like, you take Unbreakable, which is on the fringe, and you could say like, that's not a superhero movie, but nobody talking about it seriously is going to say that's not a superhero movie, because of course it is.
Of course it is. Yeah.
But so I think that it's one of the few genres where the visceral reaction is one of the big categories that you generally have to tick. And I also think that another reason would be that we don't really, because there's a barrier of entry to this one, just because it makes people feel unpleasant, I don't think that we necessarily have a lot of popular discourse and language around what makes something horrific. And so I think that we do need to talk about it, because the things that make the thing horrific are valuable things that we need to look at in our own selves and in our own lives. But very few people go to therapy voluntarily. And even fewer are like, I don't have a therapist, but I watched Hereditary and it really made me think about my relationship with my mom. You know, nobody wants to do that around beers. And then thirdly, and I think that this is just, this is a categorization that I think other genres do have, and you find it specifically in sci-fi. But it reminds me most of the music community, specifically around metal, is that there are a lot of subgenres or fringe genres that split and take away from what I would consider, because I have a very broad definition, what I would consider horror. Some people would be like, that's a thriller. Like on Twitter this summer, I saw multiple people in different conversations be like, Silence of the Lambs isn't horror, that's a thriller. And I'm like, are you kidding me?
Are you kidding me right now? No, I refuse. Like, So I find that's a really interesting point of comparison as somebody who has a lot of feelings about metal and a lot of feelings about horror, obviously. And there's like, so my partner being like an industrial DJ and somebody who like makes music in that like parallel but very different aggressive genre, a thing that I see being very different is like metal will take anything, right? Like, and for sure, as much as like fans will argue about like, you know, whether this counts as like, you know, like shoegaze metal or whether it's more black gaze or what, you know, like fine granularity, blah. Ultimately, like the is this metal argument is usually only busted out when somebody has like a weird emotion about like why everybody likes Mayaka or whatever, and it's like, okay, fine, it's the same as Neige, it's just a lady and you have an emotion about that, and let's like maybe if we talked about that we'll figure it out, but it's fine. But I find that like, you know, what metal is kind of willing to take almost anything. You know, it's like, and it might subdivide you, but it's like you're still kind of under the umbrella. Whereas industrial is like, well, that like, I don't consider blank industrial at all. It's like, that's actually over here is something that's a lot more common. And I think that like both of those, I think horror kind of like experiences both of those reactions in different kinds of ways. I think like, critically, by which I mean like serious critics of horror, right? Like people who write about horror all the time or who are making an academic study of it are kind of constantly like trying to say like, well, this is how this is actually an example of horror. Like this is how like, you know, this like what are the horrific elements in fairy tales, like what are the horrific elements in like whatever, and kind of like reaching out and trying to find try and broaden those definitions. Whereas I feel like horror fans are very invested in limiting it, and like that's a really interesting like it feels like a fan problem to me, and maybe I'm wrong here, but like it feels like a fan problem to me in the same way that like there is no one or no group of people more invested in like accepting fewer pieces of media as real examples of that media than gamers, right? It's like, well, that's not a real game, or you're not, if you play this, you're not a real gamer or whatever. And like obviously I say this is somebody who's played like 40 hours of No Man's Sky in the last 5 days or something, like for sure, like I consider myself under this unfortunate umbrella. But yeah, that like that impulse to exclude, I think is extremely interesting. And I think it comes from like both horror and gaming have very strange relationships with extremity. You know, like this, it has to be hard to count. It has to be like frustrating to count. Like you know, it has to sort of tick certain boxes in order to like be a real example of whatever. And I feel like, you know, because it's both kind of get treated as these weird like endurance races, you know, like I'm truer than you because like I'm better at Dark Souls or whatever. Like I'm, you know, real horror fans like super like New French Extremity or whatever, like what are the most like intense and extreme examples of this genre? Like that's how you kind of define, like you use that as a center, right? Like, and which in a way is kind of like inaccessibility, right? Like the center of the thing is the most inaccessible place, and then like the farther you get from that center, the like less real the less connection it has to it, or the less real it is. And I think that's a very like weird place to locate the center of your genre. But I also like I get it in a, you know what I mean? Like,
oh
it's
yeah,
like,
yeah,
what
for
is the most
sure.
distilled form of this? And it's like, well, I guess that depends on if you're like are looking at like is Nosferatu the center of horror, or is Martyrs the center of horror, right? And why do we have to define a center in the first place, or whatever, right? Anyway, I realize I've kind of gone on a bit of a journey.
No,
there.
but that's really fascinating, because those two communities specifically are frustrating in the same way, and I am like you in both ways, where I'm just like, I'm interested in this. It feels like these things, because they lack standard definitions, feel a little bit more occulted. And so for a curious mind that is enthusiastic about it, you want to go until you find that core, and there's a pleasure of obscurity where you find the thing that you kind of earned a little bit of,
Yeah.
I do think that
That makes sense.
there's a defensiveness in both camps as well. For gaming, there's a lot. I mean, for both, there's a lot of misogyny that is fueling it, because if you take a cross section of who's doing it, there's a lot of overlap in those types of people. I would say. I would also say, though, that it's, at least in gaming, games are sets of rules. And so to create a sort of gauntlet of rules for people to jump through to get into it, that makes sense aesthetically or thematically to me. But with horror, I always think it's kind of contradictory, because people are like, well, that's not horror. That's a thriller because this, and this. And for me, the definition of horror is like, okay, it brings you, a human being who likes order, into the border of where the order does no longer exist. And it reminds me of a few years ago, Quentin Tarantino got angry about It Follows, and he was like, I don't like It Follows because it breaks its own mythology at the end. And I'm like, a horror movie that has a strict mythology that can't be broken, that to me is like, you don't want a horror movie then.
Also, like, he's wrong, but
he's totally wrong. It's an amazing
like, he's also
movie.
just like incorrect, but incredible. Yeah, like if a genre is all about like liminal space and the kind of erosion of rules and the the ways in which those boundaries fall apart, and you're mad because they don't have like extremely structured boundaries, I'm like, Quentin, you're just mad because it's kind of like, I understand why he hates it. It is literally aesthetically the opposite of everything that he likes and does.
Of course, yeah.
Of course, like, that's fine. Don't like it then. Like, fine. But that doesn't make it bad. Yeah. And I think that like that, as human beings, it is hard to grapple with the fact that something I don't like personally is not bad. And I mean that in like both aesthetic and also like a moral judgment, right? Which I think is like, I think a lot of the kind of like gamer / horror / aggressive music / everything defensiveness that, a lot of these media were kind of touching on have in common is like, people who enjoy these things are often told that it is bad to enjoy these things. So there's kind of a like, you kind of define if you either turn away from that thing as a result, or you're like, well, I'm bad then, I guess. So and you kind of like, it becomes kind of a part of your defining identity, and either you decide that like, hey, wait a minute, that it was not cool, and it is like bullshit cultural garbage that results in this kind of like judgment call about this thing, and like people just don't understand catharsis, or like don't like loud noises or whatever, and are having this reaction, and fine. Or you kind of like adopt sort of a a misanthropic shell around like the thing that you like, and you know, which leads to a lot of like weird gatekeeping behavior. I think a core of that is like, this was hard for me. Liking this thing has been hard for me, because I chose to make it part of my identity instead of turning away from it. Like, I have suffered actual social consequences or imagined social consequences or whatever, but it is in some way been like a challenging thing for me that I've had to overcome. And now, until I am convinced that you have been through the same amount of negativity that I have, you have not earned your place here. Which is like also something that that I think is like pretty rampant in all sorts of like geeky or nerd media, right? Like, that's not exclusive to like horror or, you know, or aggressive music or any, or, you know, gaming in any kind of traditional sense. Like, there's a lot, I think that like stretches out a lot, but I do think that like, I also superheroes, right? Like, and I think that as a like, I think we're seeing a lot of people react very negatively to an influx of fans who haven't earned their place via this kind of like negativity or via this sort of like social censure. And I think that that's where a lot of that, like, you know, you don't deserve to be here or you shouldn't be here kind of impulse comes from, which isn't to say I have sympathy for it. I understand kind of where it comes from, while also thinking it's bullshit, which...
Yeah, I mean, you have to look into that soul and try to understand where it comes from, because it's coming from a vulnerability, even if it's negative, right? And I think people turn to all genre, either whether it's escapism or whether it's more harshly reflecting something back at you, whatever it is, it's because of a vulnerability, and you turn to those things. Genre can be a really powerful tool for communicating ideas that would repel general audiences. And for horror, I sort of think of it as it shows us a better bad place. So it gives you a place to explore what's it like to open a puzzle box and have your skin rent from you and hooked up in a weird psychosexual way. So for people who haven't seen Hellraiser, that's Hellraiser. That's Clive Barker. That's not me. But yeah, so I mean, what are some of the best examples in your mind of genre allegory?
That's a very good question. The way you put that is really, really good. So to kind of turn back to something that you said, the like the better horrible place, or like, I think something that horror and a lot of genre fiction gives us is like a safe place to explore really bad things and really traumatic things and process them. And you know, when it comes to trauma and grief and processing, I think that like that is something that is a great gift that genre gives us, like a safe place to explore things, which is not dissimilar from the way that BDSM works, right? It's like, here is a safe place to explore very difficult physical sensations and very difficult emotions, and to like role play whatever. Also LARP, incidentally, very similar kinds of things. Like, let's especially horror LARP, which is something that I like a lot. Live action role playing, for those listening at home, which has also been called full contact trick-or-treating. Some people in my life.
That rules.
It's great. We're basically like, it's like a role-playing game, except you actually do all the stuff. And to the best of your abilities, because, you know, I'm not actually a wizard going to college or whatever. But I think that like providing those kinds of safe places to do things we can't do, or things that would be very difficult for us to do, is something that all genre does really, really well. Allegory is a particular kind of subset of this, I think, when it comes to superhero fiction in particular, where we get to explore difficult ideas and difficult concepts, by which I mean, like, I sort of feel like all superhero comics are just the fairy queen over and over again. Like, we're just exploring the fairy queen over and over again. So where each character is kind of representing an idea or a concept, and then we're kind of letting those embodied characters interact with each other, and sort of like via those interactions telling a story about how concepts interact with them. So you have like justice versus cruelty. Like, what does a fist fight between those ideas look like? You have kind of stuff like that happening. And I think superhero comics is particularly excellent at exactly this. I think that, like, for me, what gets really interesting is when you, instead of letting characters or forcing characters kind of stay in that realm of the allegorical, you put a lot of effort back into humanizing them. So instead of like, here we have justice and here we have cruelty, it's like, well, what if, we had complete people who represented those things, instead of like kind of stripping someone's humanity away and just like letting them exist as the idea, or forcing them to exist as the idea. And I think that, like, that's constantly the tension between like really good comics, or really good like superhero characters or superpowered characters, is like, you have somebody who's come to represent a concept or an idea, which you can just see like through superhero names most of the time. But when they're a full, complete person, trying and failing and trying again, or in fact maybe actively working against and dismantling the ideas they're supposed to embody, that's very interesting. And I think that like the use of superheroes as a means of dismantling ideas, instead of just upholding them, and being complete humans, or trying to be complete humans within the confines of ideas, is really where stuff gets very, very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the experience of loving a superhero too, right? And so
Absolutely.
when the character goes through these emotions that you feel, like, when you I'm not gonna for some reason I was like, who can I think of? And I was like, Cyclops, and I was like, and not Scott Summers. Nobody relates to him. But yeah, like, if you're for me, I suppose it's usually Spider-Man or Iron Man, specifically Iron Man's post-traumatic arc as well, when he starts to self-identify and things like that. It's just, these are all icons for us, and we have all of these ideas that you're describing with these superheroes, that they embody them. And when we go out into our lives, we're like, I have an idea of justice. And then when it comes time to be like, it's time for me to go put justice into the world, we look to these examples that we've had since before we were born. Superheroes have been around for close to 100 years now. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you're just like, but then you have to sort of take that critical eye. And so it's interesting that superhero media and comics specifically have gotten to that self-reflexive age right now. So, well, that's a lot to think about. And thank you so much. And it's a great, it's great to speak with you about spooky things, about superhero things, all Halloween things.
All Halloween things. This has been great. I've had a complete blast.
Likewise. Thank you so much. Congratulations on Hench.